Hello, and welcome back to the Archive in Between. Would you like to hear another tale? Today's story is called Relinquishment, and it's part of a series of short stories called The Guilty King, by an author whose name does not bear pronunciation. "Come, child," Lord Velmir muttered, his half-opened eyes locked on the large bronze doors that separated his throne room from the rest of the castle. There was an eerie silence in the chamber, and cold sconces lined the walls. The tapestries that hung from the vaulted ceilings, once a brilliant vermilion, largely lost their vibrancy, overshadowed by a bleak darkness that seemed to drain the very color from their threads. Velmir himself sat on the throne in a forward lean, with one hand resting on the ruby-encrusted pommel of his royal longsword, and the other arm resting on his knee, his crown swaying back and forth on one finger. "Come face me and claim what's yours," he continued, his voice inaudible outside the range of his own ears. As he spoke, wisps of hot breath flowed in spirals through the air. Winter was close now. It would snow soon, he was sure of it. Amidst the drapery of his dark hair, his hollow blue irises locked onto a new crack forming between the doors. The sound of metal on stone echoing powerfully throughout the throne room, like the bell of death signaling someone's time had come. Stepping into the chamber, clad in golden armor, was an illustrious helmeted knight, the luster of his equipment defying the desaturation of the space. As the knight strode down the length of the equally graying rug, flaming sword in hand, Velmir felt his pulse quicken, and even more so when he saw the knight wasn't alone. Bringing up the rear were three other figures. An old crone covered in leaves and moss, whose silver hair nearly touched the floor, led the secondary charge. She walked with a limp, leaning with a shaky arm on a walking stick that looked fashioned from a thick branch with a bulbous, gnarled handle. Circling her hooded head were multiple fireflies, their light trails, abnormally, lasting long enough to form a makeshift halo. Behind her, a small creature slipped through the crack in the door and started catching up to the old woman, trying to walk briskly in order to keep pace. Its fur was ivory-colored, with strange designs in deep auburn peeking through gaps of its studded leather armor. In their grip was a longbow, modified to sit on its side and fire multiple arrows with surprising accuracy, as if it was their own personal ballista. In a comically large holster on the creature's back sat a multitude of incorporeal arrows with an ethereal sheen, too numerous for Velmir to count, but he recognized the make. They were created by the legendary weaponsmith Machthroma, which meant that if even one of those arrows were fired at him, the lord wouldn't survive. As the creature, surprisingly, started falling behind, a shadowed hand reached out and scooped it up, placing it upon an equally shadowed shoulder. The creature smiled and looked ahead at the throne as several dark purple faces emerged from various places on the shadow's body, only to fade just as quickly back into the humanoid-shaped abyss. Where the head was assumed to be, bright purple lights in the shape of eyes cast their spotlight gaze on the face of the waiting king. Floating above its right palm was a device made of concentric rings that rotated in different directions, much like a gyroscope, and in the center seemed to be a small black hole, evidence of its gravity warping the very air around it. The party of four approached the steps that led up to the throne, and the Golden Knight lifted his flaming sword to point the tip in the direction of his opponent. "In the name of Grieth VII, former lord of the realm of Nomalon, I, Hanold the First, his son, have come to claim the throne in the name of our royal family. I challenge you to trial by combat. Take up your sword and face me, that I may strike you down and force your abdication. No longer will you rule unjustly over—" Lord Velmir rose slowly as the supposed fated child, Hanold the First, began his speech. The king was a rather tall and slender individual, easily towering over the intruders in his castle. As he brought himself to stand, the commoner's clothes he wore bunched uncomfortably in unmentionable places, and it very briefly took his attention before Hanold took it back with his death threat. The moment the Golden Knight started to claim that the Lord of Nomalon was a bad ruler, Velmir interrupted his speech by tossing the heavy crown down the steps. Each clang of the crown echoed loudly in the chamber as it collided with the stonework, landing with a spin at Hanold's feet. The knight looked down through his helmet as Velmir began to make his way down the steps. As the latter neared the former, the old crone behind the knight began an incomprehensible chant. only to be silenced when the king spoke.
"You win. Take your crown."
Velmir walked past the knight, past the old woman and the shadow and the small beast on its shoulder. He combed his long hair out of his eyes with his fingers, looking around at the otherwise empty chamber that he was glad to finally be rid of. But before he could make it to the door, he heard a whistling behind him as one of Machthrorma's fabled arrows whizzed past his head before splitting into 100, striking the door with enough force to slam it shut before recollecting its copies back into a singular form. The now deposed king stared blankly at the door, then closed his eyes and sighed as he turned part-way to give his attention back to the party who'd decided to waste his time a little more. The shadow was closest, their once free hand holding on to the creature's longbow, with the creature itself drawing back the string, another of Machthrorma's arrows loaded onto the rest. In the shadow's other hand, the device floating, missing one of its rings. "Where do you think you're going?" A feminine voice rose into existence from within the shadow.
"Your leader," Velmir began, pointing the longsword at the knight, "wanted to depose me. Consider me deposed. The throne is yours. Rule this empty kingdom how you see fit."
"What have you done to the people of this land?" called the creature, pulling back even tighter on the bowstring. "On our journey through your poisoned lands, we found nary a soul."
Velmir turned the rest of the way to face back towards the throne.
"Done?" he asked, motioning to himself with a half-hearted grin. "I've done nothing to them. They left of their own volition. No kingdom can bear a despondent ruler."
Hanold weaved around the old woman and stood at the shadow's side. "Cartha, steady your hand," he ordered to the furry creature, who hesitated at first, then relented on the tension of the string. The knight removed his helmet, letting a forest of knotted blonde hair free from its cage. As beads of sweat slipped into the tiniest rivers that fell down his face, Hanold called across the room again, his attention now torn away from the crown. "They left on their own?" he continued, uncertain with his words. "But why?" Velmir smiled. "My lord," chimed Trellis the attendant, stepping up to the side of the throne. Lord Velmir was in the process of addressing concerns from the people of Nomalon as his attention was redirected. "Trellis," the king replied, smiling through clenched teeth, "interrupting a lord's duties is unwise. Forgive me, my lord, but a mystic has arrived in the kingdom. She speaks of the future and has specifically requested your presence." Velmir's hand moved to his chin, his eyes still locked on the commoner who now fell to their knees, her words seeming distant in relation to this news. Before the attendant could ask the lord's wishes, Velmir waved him away for a moment. "Madam," he finally responded, "we will see to the restoration of your farm. In the meantime, you'll be granted a tithe in order to procure food for your family, to be repaid in full at your earliest convenience. Consider this matter resolved." The lord waved away the commoner, whose beaming face turned up toward the vaulted ceiling of the throne room as she expressed her thanks and was led out by the royal guard, then rose from his throne and signaled the end of his work for the day. "Your eminence will continue hearing your matter at first light tomorrow," Trellis announced, his voice carrying all the way to the bronze doors that separated the throne room from the rest of the castle. As the rest of the crowd began to file out, Velmir waved his attendant over. Trellis traipsed across the tiled floor, intricate designs bearing the coat of arms of Nomalon, two trees twisting through one another, each spiraling around the blade of a sword. The attendant stopped at Lord Velmir's side, awaiting his next order. "This mystic," Velmir started, crossing his arms over his chest as he stared at that same emblem on the floor. "You said she can tell the future. Have you tried it?" Trellis, pulling his feathered cap from atop his tousled brown hair, shook his head. "No, sir. If you ask me, mystics are fearsome. They know things about the world that even the world has yet to glimpse. Such knowledge must come from a dark source." "Where is she now?" You wish to see her, sir?" Trellis stammered. "But why?" "The armies of the guilty king have started to amass, boy. As we speak, they're laying waste to the territories of Ardmal and the Faultlands. It's only a matter of time before they lay siege to Nomalon and destroy its people. I wish to speak with this mystic, and perhaps learn of their plans before even they know them, to prepare our forces to counter the threat." "You are most wise, my lord," Trellis answered, bowing his head. "The mystic has set up her tent in the markets. It is, by far, the largest tent in the vicinity. In fact, most of the merchants have been complaining about it. Their stalls are being moved because of her arrival." That will be dealt with, countered the king. If her purpose in the city is to tell me the future, then I'll make it quick. Summon the guard captain. She'll accompany me to the market. Trellis nodded and jogged back across the chamber, bursting through a smaller set of doors into another part of the castle, and leaving Lord Velmir to stroke his chin as he set about making his way to the front of the castle. Positioned all around the king of Nomalon were the royal guard, spaced apart every 10 feet, bearing plate armor of a bright vermilion emblazoned with the Nomalon crest. As the king passed by, each of them saluted in reverence to their ruler, and he earnestly nodded, his mind occupied. Before he realized it, he was outside, standing on the steps of the castle with the kingdom of Nomalon before him in all its resplendent glory. You know, spoke a low voice behind Velmir, pulling him away from his thoughts. Sending your page boy to ask me out on a date isn't the way I envisioned us finally having some alone time. Velmir turned to meet the emerald eyes of the captain of his royal guard, Ren, as she descended the steps of the castle entrance, wearing a set of commoner's clothes. Her short blonde hair flicked around in the slight breeze as she met the king's gaze with a smirk, her muscled frame quaking with each heavy step. To think that this is the second time you assume I'm inviting you out for a romantic evening, replied Velmir with a grin on his own face, lowering his arms in the presence of one of the strongest soldiers in his army. Your contemporaries wouldn't like that. My contemporaries can choke on stale bread, responded the captain, placing a hand on the king's shoulder. Besides, they know I'm joking. You know I'm joking. Sure, Velmir chuckled, patting Ren's hand. Whatever you say. Has Trellis told you why you're accompanying me? He sure did. Said something about a mystic in the city. I assume you're trying to get palm read? Not quite. I figure, since she's here, I might as well see if I can get an advantage against the guilty king. I wouldn't sweat him, Vel. There's no way he's making it past the valley, even if he is undead. Velmir's brows inched closer together. Maybe, but I don't want to take the chance. If we're not prepared, Nomalon could fall. Ren crossed her arms and nodded. I get it, she agreed, her voice empty of life. I've lost people to him. Not just my men, but people close to me. I want to take him down, probably more than anyone here. Then we should speak to the mystic while she's here, Velmir concluded, searching Ren's eyes. She wasn't the only one who lost people to the guilty king, but she was a front-runner for having lost them most. Every time he glimpsed her presence, he couldn't help but feel a swelling in his chest for having withstood as much as she had. Her strength didn't solely lie in her martial prowess. Velmir felt his cheeks burn as Ren lifted her head and nodded, the king turning away before she could see the redness on his skin. After you, my liege, Ren directed, attempting to playfully mimic the lord's attendant, much to Velmir's bemusement. Side by side, the two started off towards the market, sharing laughs and playful nudges with each other. If I didn't go there that day, you would have had your destined struggle. I would have driven the four of you into the dirt. I would have buried you beneath my throne as a message to those who dared to challenge my rule, and nailed the spoils of my victory to the walls as trophies. But you won't receive that today. You receive my apathy. You receive my surrender. You receive my burden. The throne room was quiet for an uncomfortably long time. The old woman was the first to break the silence. Hanold, she started, puzzled at the lack of urgency. Now's our chance. While he's refusing to take up arms, we can— Quiet, Penem. The knight cut her off, silencing her with an open palm. By now, the flame on his sword was dying, an indicator that the enchantment was wearing off. He reluctantly started approaching Velmir, sword still at the ready, but much less so. What do you mean, your burden? Hanold asked, his voice shaky. Velmir cast his gaze to the ground and closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes, the king found himself on the edge of the market, visibly annoyed with the size of the gaudy tent before him. He pinched the bridge of his nose, then motioned to the canvas structure. Was all this really necessary? Velmir prompted, watching the irked expressions of the displaced merchants passing him by. Ren snickered before she, too, gestured towards the tent. She's clearly grifting a lot of no-betters out of their money, she reacted, placing a palm on the canvas, then on her own shirt. I felt better. You invite vulgar responses, Ren. Signed, sealed, and lost in transit, Vel. Come on, let's see what she has to say. The atmosphere was stuffy with the scent of burned incense. The dome of the tent featured a hole in the top, illuminating the largest room in the tent with natural light. Sat in the center was an older woman dressed in similar fashion with her environment, equally lurid fabric surrounding her feeble form. She greeted the two newcomers with a wry smile, placing a hand on a transparent glass orb and lifting it from a square pillow.
"Welcome,"
the woman intoned in a raspy voice as she waved to the king.
"I've been waiting for you, your grace. You—"
She directed her hand to indicate the guard captain.
"Not so much."
"She is my bodyguard," answered Velmir, pointing to Ren. "I asked her to accompany me here. Being a ruler leaves you open to danger, and I trust her with my life."
"Do you?"
foiled the woman, the corners of her lips curling upward even further.
"Perhaps you shouldn't."
"Excuse me." Ren stepped forwards, fists clenched, but Velmir placed a hand on the captain's arm. She looked at him with furrowed brows, and he returned her gaze with a reassuring nod. As she relaxed her stance, he walked into the center of the room and sat down across from the mystic, crossing his legs. "I'm here because I've heard you could tell the future," Velmir initiated, placing his hands on his thighs. "I'm not a believer, but if what I've been told is true, then perhaps you can help this kingdom with your insight. The guilty king makes his march southward. There is no doubt that Ardmal has already collapsed, and the Faultlands will likely face the same fate. We are hopeful his march ends at the valley, but even my most trusted advisors aren't certain, and so I'm turning to your clairvoyance. I wish to know what plans the guilty king will have put into action in the future, in the hopes that I can prevent him from taking Nomalon and, as a result, destroying the last great bastion for freedom and life in this land."
"What do you ask, my lord?"
acknowledged the mystic as she lifted the glass orb in her hand.
"It's something I can't allow you. I am simply a conduit for the chaos that governs our very lives, and I tell my fortunes through this focus. Place your hands upon it and glimpse your coming days."
Ren squinted her eyes and raised her voice. "Vel, you have no idea if that's dangerous." "There are a lot of things I don't know, Ren. If this woman has the answers, then perhaps the pain of awareness is worth the weight of knowledge." With that, Velmir lifted his hands and cupped the sides of the orb. For a moment, the tent was silent and uneventful. But then Velmir was overtaken by an unseen force, throwing his head back and facing skyward as his wide-open eyes glossed over in a sickly, pale gray. He found himself in a land of fog, figures forming from the mist, unable to hold their shape for long before they fell back into the haze. Amidst it all, shadows floated from plume to plume. Velmir reached for his sword, feeling only an emptiness where the handle should have been. As the nervousness started to settle in, the fog itself began to separate, revealing a more put-together figure that stood proudly in the realm. Clad in golden armor, the figure raised a flaming sword to the heavens, standing in front of an ornate throne that looked eerily similar to the one in the royal castle. A short distance away, a separate section of the mist swirled about and formed a new figure, one almost identical to the king himself. A hazy clone of Velmir now stood several feet from the golden figure, its back turned to the throne. From the looks of things, the king started to put it all together. But before he could glimpse the information he sought, Velmir was returned to the tent, the fog in his eyes dissipating immediately. He drew a sharp breath inward and folded forward, clutching his ribs as he coughed wildly. Ren fell to his side and gripped his shoulders, staring daggers into the mystic as she attempted to console the king's shaking frame.
"What have you done?"
the captain of the guard demanded, her nostrils flaring.
"The king has been shaken by your ill magic, and possibly in—"
Velmir's hand found Ren's and patted it, catching her attention. His body was motionless for a second. Then his chest pushed outward as he drew a deep breath, straightening his upper body. His hands found his thighs once more, and his sight fell on the glass orb that had now descended back onto its pillow. "Who are they?" asked the Lord of Nomalon. The mystic's smile had faded. She knew his belief was now genuine.
"She called you an illegitimate heir,"
Velmir retorted, his fingers tightening around the lustrous handle of his longsword as the night slowly closed the distance between them.
"Said your sword would fall upon my kingdom in 4 months' time, and that you would take the throne from me."
"Your mystic was right," spat the knight, whose enchanted blade was now only warm and dark. A chuckle escaped Velmir's slim body.
"That she was."
"So why have the kingdom's people vanished?"
"I told you,"
Velmir replied.
No kingdom can bear a despondent ruler."
"She's lying," grumbled Ren, flicking a gold coin onto the counter of a bread merchant before lifting a loaf from a basket. Breaking it in two, she offered half of it to Velmir, who gestured his refusal with a wave of his hand. He looked different now, his eyes searching the cobblestone for some sort of answer to his newfound problem. The captain watched him as she ate, taking a moment to toss the unclaimed half of bread towards a beggar in an adjacent alley. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Velmir didn't answer. She waited several seconds before she tried to grab his attention yet again. "Vel, come on. You don't really believe that woman, do you?" "She told me my future, Ren," the king responded quietly. By now, the two had found a quiet street on the way back to the castle. "The problem with the known future is that it can't be changed. It doesn't matter what I do. That man will arrive, and I will be dethroned. If I try to prepare for it, I'll fall right into the trap." "You have a royal guard," Ren countered, grabbing the king's shoulder and stopping him in his tracks. She turned him until she could look in his eyes. Only now could she really see that she was a head taller than him. "You have me." Velmir's short, raven-black hair feathered around in the wind as he gazed up into Ren's eyes. The smile that formed on his lips in response to her words didn't last long. "There's no point in fighting it, Ren." Her shoulders sunk and she pulled her hands away from him. Ren's eyes narrowed as she gestured to the king. "Where is the man I grew up with? Where's the conviction he just had? Where is the ruler of Nomalon?" "He's 4 months away," answered Velmir, resuming his walk back to the castle and leaving Ren in a stunned silence.
"The people's wants and needs fell by the wayside. My attention was on you, on waiting for your arrival. And now you're here, but you're seeking a fight against the wrong enemy. There are bigger fish to fry."
"What do you mean?" Velmir's head turned toward the door. The chamber was dark. Velmir watched the door open as Ren, dressed down from her armor, entered the throne room. The medallion that once graced her neck now rested in the clutches of her white-knuckled grip. Her footfalls echoed off the stonework of the abandoned chamber as she approached the steps.
"You're still here,"
Velmir greeted, his voice gravelly. A smile barely graced his lips. Ren didn't seem as amused. "Not for long," she said, looking up at the shrinking form of the king. "The last of the willing residents have been evacuated. I've sent the guards to escort them to Rung's wall. They'll have time to prepare. You can come with us, you know."
"My future hasn't come to pass yet."
"Stop speaking of the future," cried Ren, angrily tossing the medallion onto the steps. "While you sat there and let this city crumble because you were so obsessed with the future, you neglected the present danger. You stopped answering the people, stopped providing for the good of the land. You put your people to the side and... Her voice was getting shakier by the second, and tears began to stream down her face. Velmir's remark was conversely quiet.
"It's almost over, Ren. I can sense his presence in the kingdom. When he arrives, there will be no fanfare, no cheering audience, no struggle for the crown. Only silence and ease and freedom."
"I watched her flee from this room in tears," Velmir replied, matter-of-factly, looking down at the medallion in his hand.
"I told her I'd send you to the wall to join the rest of the people there. If you are the rightful heir, perhaps you can protect them against what's coming."
Hanold was now a few feet from the former king, but the grip on his sword loosened. He was no longer primed for battle. The shadow floated to his side, another set of faces emerging from the black ether, only to subside back into the dark within. Another ring on the device that floated above their hand was gone. "What's coming?" they asked. Hanold looked to them and nodded. "Ulleren's right," he agreed. "You said this Ren mentioned a present danger. What is it?" Velmir's head turned back to the party. His half-opened eyes were now more intense than ever.
"What do you know of the guilty king?"
Thanks for stopping by and listening to my story. If you'd like to hear another, consider popping by again. If you want me to read something specific, leave a suggestion and I'll see what I can do. I look forward to seeing you again.